Welcome to Peter York's Culture Wars House Party. I'm Peter York and my podcast is about culture wars, disinformation and misinformation. It's about the way modern politics is so often played out with symbols and scapegoats, with dramatic and emotive narratives instead of the real issues. It's about small things blown up to upset and distract people, made up causes and astroturf organizations invented by PRs and lobbyists. I'll be talking to the players and the commentators in these culture wars and getting them to explain what they think is really happening and what's not happening because it's made up. And then, if we can, we'll ask some vital questions, a bit of my guests' backstories. Our guest today is Professor Danny Dorling. Now, Professor Danny Dorling is a British social geographer, BSG. He's currently, in 1971, Professor of Geography, attached, as it says in Wikipedia, to St. Peter's College at the University of Oxford. He's been doing that since 2013. In fact, Professor Dorling has been a university toiler all his working life and an actual prof since 2000, when he became Professor of Quantitative Human Geography at the University of Leeds. In 2013, he was Professor for the Public Understanding of Social Science at the University of Sheffield. Hold on that right there, you might well ask. How do you go from geography, as we might roughly have defined it, most of us, to social science? You might have imagined they were very different things. So I'll ask Professor Dorling to explain that. But his greatest subject, judging by his books and papers and talks, seems to be inequality. Back in 2019, he wrote a piece in an utterly obscure, to me anyway, journal called Emotion, Space and Society, in which he explained that geography was a discipline from young men drawn from the upper orders of society, those destined to rule over the lower orders. He also explained that geography, which I'd assume was a pretty obvious global discipline, was really only taught in a tiny minority of universities around the world, and that it attracted a kind of Tim Nice but dim student from posher families. A number of English geographers wrote in to complain about this description. Back in 2013, I wrote a small book for Penguin, one of a group they published to celebrate the beginning of the Tube in 1863. Danny Dorling wrote one too, about the central line called the 32 Steps, explaining the social differences between the populations of the areas served by each station in terms of very basic things like life expectancy, wealth, etc. By contrast, my book, The Blue Ribbon, was about the overwhelming poshness of the original Piccadilly line areas, and then the modern architecture of its later extensions in the 1930s, which brought modernism to the Tudor-Beaton suburbs. And from 2015, Professor Dorling was a great supporter of Jeremy Corbyn's version of Labour politics, even appearing in a party political broadcast directed by Ken Loach. That's stardom for you. Danny Dorling, I wanted to read and hear what you've got to say, particularly about class, life chances, inequality. I think it took me some time to clock that you were called a geographer, and then I didn't know why. Could you explain it in simple terms?
I'm called a geographer because I started at university in a geography department, but also in a maths department. I did a joint honours degree, and I was into computers. So I wasn't particularly political. I was just into how we could draw maps of millions of people, because that was exciting back in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And I slowly moved towards being interested in inequalities because the data I looked at was showing rising inequality, going up and up and up. So my maps were showing something that was interesting. The discipline of geography has changed greatly over the last roughly 125 years. We didn't used to have geography departments in British universities. Mine in Oxford is one of the first. It kind of dates from the late 1890s, when the RGS, the Royal Geographical Society, raised money to help establish a geography department. And the need for a geography department and this was expressed in a letter to the Times that the RGS published at the time, was to train young men to help to run the colonies.
Ah.
So geography as a discipline in Britain is a practical discipline. This is why you had to learn about rivers and floods and mountains and where coal came from and how cities are organised, because you might find yourself in charge of somewhere. And you can see why this made sense in the 1890s, and it was a young discipline and thrusting and growing. But then the problem for geography was that we lost or gave up the colonies. And so my discipline had to reinvent itself. And it kind of split into two halves. One half is scientific, that's physical geography, which now mainly does things like climate change. And the other half is human geography. You know, those of us who used to worry about how we control millions of people had to find something else to do.
Got it.
And so we're still looking at people, but no longer from the point of view of how do we get them to do what we want.
I think I got it slightly conflated with geology, mountain ranges, and with rivers and rock formations and so on. I remember when I did O-level geography, I was very pleased with myself that I knew that the Philips factories were located in Eindhoven. Why did I know that? Why did I put that down? And did I get credit for it? I don't know. But it's very different from what you're describing. And so if it is a particularly British kind of concern, and also a particularly upper class concern, it's because it's the guys who were going to run the empire.
Yes, that's what it moved towards. I mean, you could make a case that the very early days of geography, the upper classes would go and study the greats and the traditional subjects. So actually, it was a little bit lower class at the very start. You know, you were going to have to go out and live your life in a colony.
Yes.
But it slowly rose in prominence to reach this point. Of over 80 university subjects, when we look at the background of undergraduates in Britain, we find that they're most likely, if they're studying geography, to have been brought up in the most affluent areas and least likely to have been brought up in the poorer areas. There are lots of reasons for this, not least that geography is often not taught at A-level in poorer parts of Britain, because you have to have quite some confidence in you to go and study for a degree that doesn't obviously lead to a job.
But it's persistent, so you're saying. This imperial leftover is still visible in universities today.
A little bit. It's changed a lot. I mean, it reached a height in the early 2000s. The most common job for a geographer was to go to work into finance, international banking.
Yeah.
And that was some of that persistence. The second most common was to be a geography teacher. The banking crash of 2008 ended that, and so it's now a much more wider.
Yeah.
But, you know, climate change, we're very popular amongst undergraduates because we are the subject which will teach you about climate change. So we change, we adapt. There isn't some core set of facts you have to know to be a geographer. It is something which has changed a lot over the decades, but it's very, very British. Most geography departments, Britain has one in most of its universities. They only exist in less than a tenth of universities in the United States. They don't have a geography department in Harvard and Yale. And most of the well-known departments around the world are in former colonies. They're in Singapore, they're in Hong Kong, they're in India.
I feel utterly ashamed that I didn't know this.
Well, we tend not to point it out. My department has ranked number one in the world for at least 12 years, and we're very proud of this. We don't want to say it's not that hard to rank number one in the world when you're not competing as much as, say, physics is.
Now, the Western world, we know it, you've said it, is becoming increasingly unequal. And one of our dubious distinctions is that we're in the forefront there. Could you describe the full achievement of British inequality and how it compares with the rest of the world?
Yeah.
And how we got there?
This is the most important measure is income inequality, how much money people receive every year. This is the one which affects life the most for people. We actually had become quite an equal country by the 1960s and 1970s. Only Sweden of large European countries was more equal than us. We were quite unusual then. Our inequality then rose enormously in the 80s, every year in the 80s. when the income tax rate was brought down for the well-off, they celebrated and made even more money. There was 3 million people unemployed. They were very poor. And so the gap between those on the least and the most rose and rose and rose. By 2009, we overtook Portugal to become the most unequal country in Western Europe. And not many years later, we were on a par with the most unequal country in Eastern Europe. So we are by far the most unequal country in Europe. There are two other countries on the edge of Europe which are almost as unequal, if not slightly more. One is Turkey and one is Russia. And interestingly, these three countries are all the homes of former empires. The Ottoman Empire, the USSR, and of course the biggest empire the world's ever known, which is Britain. But there was a time when I was young when the gaps between people were the lowest ever. So this is not something set in stone. It can change. And currently we're way up there.
How do we compare with the USA?
We're slightly more equal than the USA. The USA is more unequal, has a few million people homeless, living in cars and so on. The average person in the USA is pretty badly off. Their household might be on $50,000 or $60,000 a year. People always get confused about the USA. They think it's rich, but it's only a minority of the population who are rich. China is actually now very similar to the USA. So China has become unequal as well. But Europe is the home to the most equal people on the planet. We just happen to be the most unequal country in Europe. Give or take Bulgaria. I always have to say that. We're waiting for the day when Bulgaria improves slightly and we can actually not have to caveat this.
How are the trend lines looking on this, and particularly our levels of inequality?
Ours have just started to improve. And this is the first time we've had a drop. It's very small and tenuous, but the first time we've had a drop, the last drop was about 1918, 1919, and they're very big. So it's been a long time. The kind of way it works, if you think about a group like civil servants, since 2008, senior civil servants have had a 25% real terms pay cut. Junior civil servants have had a 12% pay cut. They're all worse off, but the gap between them has narrowed. And the same has happened in general. We no longer get across-the-board pay increases. Another group, the communication workers for BT and so on. Before the pandemic, they used to argue and get a 3% pay rise, which meant that the highest paid people got the most. But since then, the pay deals have been tiered. The lowest paid workers get the biggest pay increases, the highest less. So we may be at the turn of this, which is kind of good news, except nobody is happy because this increased equality is associated with everybody being worse off and the cost of living crisis.
So are you describing the last 1.5 years, or what exactly?
I'm describing the period since around about 2018. Right. I think 2018 was the high point. Yeah. And our only analogy is the 1920s and 30s, when there was a big drop in inequality, but almost nobody noticed because we had a general strike in 1926, we had mass unemployment. But half of the equality that was achieved in Britain in the last century was actually achieved by 1939. Mm-hmm. The rest occurred after the Second World War. So it's when equality begins to rise, it generally isn't noticed and it's not generally in happy times.
So was it the backwash from Michael Young's 1945 manifesto and all the things that brought in? Can we attribute it to that?
His manifesto helped solidify it, but there was consensus before 1945. William Beveridge was a Liberal peer, he brought in the Beveridge Report. Quentin Hogg, the MP for Oxford at the time. Yes. Yeah, Quentin Hogg, who was seen as, when he was young, as being on the right of the party, in the House of Commons, gave an incredible speech in support of the Beveridge Report, saying it was economically feasible. So we always give the credit to Michael Young and to Labour in 1945, but in fact, most of the gain had occurred by 1939. And what occurred after 1939 and during the war was an amazing growth of consensus amongst the younger MPs across the House of Commons and in society. Partly because we'd made our young men go and fight a Second World War, and the idea that you could come back to 1930s levels of unemployment and inequality was just seen as unfeasible. The change was enormous. We went from 1918, where the most common job for women was to work in service, to a point by the 1960s where there were hardly any servants.
Yeah.
This is an amazing shift in our society. We're now back to around 1936 levels of inequality. But it's a different, we have lots of Deliveroo drivers now. In effect, our servants bringing us food. We don't tend to have live-in servants.
Yeah.
But we do have a society which is very, very split as compared to what I grew up with as a child.
How widely is this known?
Much more than was the case 20 years ago. A lot of lobbying. I mean, if you're looking at the issues that you're interested about, advocacy and so on, probably the most effective lobbying group have been Oxfam. Every year at Davos, they produce a report about how many billionaires would fit in a bus and have more wealth than, over half the world's population. So there's been a lot of awareness raising. And when we do polls about what are people concerned about now, 10 years ago, unemployment was the biggest worry, but since then it's been inequality, poverty, and cost of living. And both of those issues have been seen as more important than unemployment and have topped the polls. So there's a widespread general awareness in the UK that inequality is, I would argue, the major issue. The problem is it's inequality, poverty, and cost of living, because it's not a nice, easy phrase. People are 30% off than they were in 2021. They can feel it. Debts are higher. Less people can afford to go on holiday. A third of children are living in poverty. Something like 40% of children have no summer holiday, whereas other children have multiple holidays.
If you take the polling about people's concerns, and can you disaggregate that first group? How many people, rather than saying times are hard, things are expensive, there are kids on my street who don't have a decent meal, etc., how many people are actually citing inequality?
It's always put as inequality and poverty. So inequality on its own, there was a book called The Spirit Level, published around about 2010. And that helped to raise it. So inequality on its own, at various times, does poll well. One of the key changes that's been quite remarkable is we've gone in 20 years from admiring what we used to call wealth creators to a general scepticism of people with lots of money. That way in which we used to laud people who'd made lots of money and say if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have jobs.
Yeah.
I don't think this is just my gut feeling. I think that has gone away. This has been helped enormously by Donald Trump. Donald Trump, in his inauguration, having what it was like 5 of the 7 or 8 richest men in the world behind him. The inequality is associated with Trump and Trump's men and Elon Musk. And that must have had an effect. So the era in the past when New Labour was saying how comfortable it was with the rich has gone entirely. And of course is most closely associated with Peter Mandelson, which kind of helps bury it.
Yes.
As a, I'm not worried about what the rich earn as long as they pay the taxes. That is associated with Peter.
Yes. But if you take Oxfam aside, explicitly political, party political voices, who is making most of equality now? Who is talking about it effectively most?
Now, but only in the last year, it has been the Green Party. It is their number one issue that they campaign on and they talk about. And they used this bogeyman of the billionaires, which is the easiest one, but the Green Party talk about inequality most, partly because I think it's how they can see them can get their vote up. They can't talk about climate much more than they do already. And climate change has been an issue which has actually reduced in terms of people's fears over time. People have got a bit bored with being told endlessly the climate's terrible. So the Green Party most recently, when Corbyn was in charge of Labour, inequality appeared over 30 times in the 2017 and 2019 manifestos. It only appeared once in the Conservative Party manifesto, I think. And that's dropped with Labour more recently. And there's the big arguments within the Labour Party over who should be leader and so on are very much, should we be talking about becoming a more equal society or should we be talking about growth? And that's the division within Labour. So Labour doesn't, at the moment, press on it because the group of people who want to talk about growth are in charge. But they're being pressed by people like Andy Burnham who want to talk more about inequality. But it's not a brilliant slogan. because it's a complicated thing. It's about the nature of our society and about opportunities. And it can look quite bitter. If you complain, for instance, that in terms of education, we definitely spend more on education of school children than any other country in Europe, but that's only because a third of our spending is private. As for the 93% of children who go to state schools, we spend less and less on their education. We have enormous numbers of school buildings and playing fields, but they're not accessible to most children. So it can very quickly sound like you're wanting to have a go at the people who've got the most. If you look across Europe, private education is very minimal in most European countries. And what private education there is often actually largely subsidised by the state.
So it's not like the 7% odd that we've got here.
No, it's much smaller. It's complicated because they sometimes call some kinds of schools in France private, but they're actually almost entirely state-funded.
Yeah.
So they're not private, and you can't buy your way in. The only country in the world which spends as much on 7% going private is Chile, the only other country that we compare with. Even the United States has a smaller private sector. But that's partly because the state education sector in the US is so divided by whether you live in a rich county that can fund its schools or a poor county.
Yeah.
But it is normal in the vast majority of the affluent world to send your child to a state school, and very normal in France and in Germany and in the Netherlands.
Now, you've been talking about the extraordinary change in the Greens. What exactly happened to the status of climate change as a worry subject in this country?
When people are asked about 18 things to worry about, climate has dropped about 8th or 9th. It currently drops every year a little bit. There was too much crying wolf, I think, 12 years to save the world, absolute disaster occurring. But of course, climate change is incredibly important. I think climate change also became associated with well-off people telling other people how to live their lives.
Yes.
And that didn't help the lobbying. There was an amazing consensus. So, the BBC and Sky and almost all the political parties agreed that they would agree on climate change. We would no longer present it as a debate. It absolutely is real. So internationally, we only have 9% of our population are climate skeptics. This is the lowest on the planet. 91% of people believe in climate change. But
they're not that bothered.
Well, it's something that's far away in the future. It's decades. We're not a hot country. When you look across Europe at how concerned people are about climate change, the further south they are, the more concerned they are, because they're experiencing these really hot summers.
Yeah.
People actually complain in the south of France about how hot it now gets. Further north, people tend to be a bit more sanguine. And being told that this is the most important thing when your grown-up children cannot get a mortgage and when you're worrying about debts. And in terms of inequality, our poorest fifth of people in Britain now receive less money than the poorest fifth across all of Eastern Europe put together. Our poorest fifth are poorer. But those above them don't have very much. Being told to worry about this thing when other aspects of life are difficult is difficult. In much more equal countries, Norway will be a classic, it's much easier to get the population as a whole to worry about climate change because people are not struggling. Norwegians always get annoyed when I say this, but the poor in Norway really, compared to our worse off people, are not struggling, and so they're able to worry about wider issues.
But how are we doing in terms of climate change concern amongst the priorities of other nations, other European nations? Where do they put it?
Oh, we're not that bad because we were so good. But we were only so good because of this consensus amongst the elite not to put another side forward. If you remember, in the 1990s, it was possible to reasonably argue that this may be temporary. And then we had hot summer after hot summer after hot summer worldwide, and clearly it became scientifically uncontentious. But we were unusual, I think, as a nation, in that we so strongly didn't allow this to be debated. And that's now mean we got into a position where the Conservatives have broken that consensus and are willing to move away from it.
Yeah.
And of course, in particular, it's possibly Reform's strongest ticket. with immigration as well. Reform's strongest ticket can be, we'll get your petrol prices down, we'll look after you, we'll get your heating down. Look how cheap it is to buy electricity in other countries. We won't fund these wind farms and solar panels and so on. So it's allowed the space for the far right to talk about something.
Is that the British translation of drill, baby, drill?
Yes, yeah. And you see it in France as well, with the Front National worrying a lot about people's costs of buying petrol again. It's effective.
And blaming it on virtue signalling middle class people who don't know they're born.
Yeah, and saying, look, we only produce 1% of global emissions. We can't make much effect on this. Why are we making people suffer so much? Rather than the argument that might be more effective to put forward would be to say that if we get energy security and work out our energy well, we'll have much safer, longer run energy costs. They'll be lower. That argument would work better because you talk about people's actual lives and interest rather than telling them some island in the Pacific may go underwater and you really need to worry about that.
Yeah. And that some people may have overplayed their hands.
Oh, certainly. And I did a book last year called The Next Crisis, and I have a section on it on the first village to be lost to the sea in Wales, which is called Fairborn. Now, Fairborn almost certainly isn't going to be lost to sea rise. The Welsh government said it couldn't support it. It absolutely decimated house. Nobody was going to buy a house there. You couldn't get insurance. But now they're quietly backtracking about this because sea level rise is, it's only a few centimetres. It doesn't actually result in the flooding on the coast of Wales. Far more serious in Britain is the fact we're still tipping. And so our Yorkshire coast, our eastern coast, is dropping into the ocean far faster than any rise of sea. But it's this constant overplaying, blaming every thunderstorm. It really begins to grate. It's sad because this is a very serious issue.
Well, any right-wing rant at length that I hear always includes at least three of the favourite counterculture, culture wars subjects, today's counterculture. It does something about trans and warns men that people are dragging up in order to get into the ladies' loos and rape your wives and daughters. Depending on the audience, particularly in America, it does something about abortion and then it does something about the social character of environmentalists and environmentalist fans as being so lucky they don't know they're born. And that for the rest of us, it's drill, baby, drill. So by those proximities, you begin to recognize all those favorite culture wars arguments that the right uses so effectively. Now, all along with greater inequality, because we're leading the pack. Well, we have been leading the pack, but it's a West-wide problem. Along with greater inequality, however, all the current indices seem to say that the world's getting much more authoritarian and much less democratic, whatever we think we mean by that. Now, a correlation is not a cause, but are they related by any chance?
Inequality and far-right voting is related. It's a medium-level correlation. It's helped greatly if you decide the Republicans are far-right. That strengthens it a lot. So the more unequal states in the United States are more likely to vote Republican, and they're the ones with a bigger gap between the rich and the poor. Across Europe, we get the same thing. The two outliers, until recently, were France, which voted more far-right than it should have done, given that France is quite equal, and Germany, which didn't used to vote far-right enough, which was historical reasons that Germans had a thing against the far-right, although that's gone away. So the graphs are kind of neatened up. That the far-right message, which, remember, also includes immigration, and this is key, that they will protect you from the outside world, works better with a population that's more frightened, anxious and concerned, and levels of fear rise when inequality rises. And they rise for everybody. Because if you're at the top of society, the top 10% in Britain now take 40% of all income every year. The bottom 90%, most people are taking 60%. So if you're just a dropout of the top 10%, the changes in your life, whereas in a much more equal European country, and this isn't just the Nordic states, the 5 Nordic states are now 5 countries that are slightly more equal than them, which include Belgium. And there are 5 which are almost as equal, which include France and Germany. In these more equal European countries, you can think about your children and you can think about them doing a much wider range of jobs than you can do in Britain if you're in the top 10%, because people who work in nursing are better paid, car mechanics are better paid, but also bankers are paid less. When we were a member of the EU, we used to get statistics on bankers, and we had over 2,000 paid over $1 million a year. And the next highest was in Germany, or something like 170. It was tiny. So in more equal countries, you don't have to worry so much about your children's future than you do in a very unequal country, because dropping down is so frightening. It's the same all the way down the income scale. It's actually obviously much more serious down the income scale because you're talking about going hungry. So you have this fear of the future. And Nigel Farage coming along and saying, I'm going to make it all good, is welcomed by people. It's what they want to hear.
Why is it that people believe things which aren't true? That's at the core of culture wars, as explained. My classic explanation of culture wars is Boris Johnson talking about his great political campaigners and explaining that his particular Australian/American skill was to throw a dead cat on the table. Whereupon people would crowd round and say, this is Boris Johnson being Australian, Struth, there's a dead cat on the table. And they'd talk about the dead cat and the ghastliness and how it got there and so on. And so said Boris Johnson, because they were talking about that, they weren't thinking about the things you didn't want them to talk and think about. Now, that's what I'd call a proper effective culture war. And that's what I'd call something that, for a variety of reasons, is overwhelmingly done on the right. People on establishment broadcasters and writers talk as if there were some sort of equality in the matter. And you may disabuse me, but it seems to me that for a variety of reasons, this stuff is done more, much more, overwhelmingly more, i.e., created culture wars on the right than on the left.
I agree with you. I think there are 2 reasons. The first is, I think Boris learnt this when he was Mayor of London. When he was Mayor of London, he didn't want to do anything. He didn't want to bring in any policies. He didn't want to change anything. He wanted small government. But he had to do something. So he ends up, going down zip wires and getting stuck.
Yes.
Doing a stunt every other day, because he can't just sit there in his office or go and play golf and do nothing. But he didn't want to do anything because he doesn't believe in government. So if you don't actually believe in doing things, if you think it's bad to have government, you need a distraction. The other, much more insidious thing is if your true politics, and Johnson again said this at one point when he talked about the top cornflakes being shaked out of the cornflake packet, he had a self-belief about his IQ, and it was hilarious because he got the IQ statistics wrong. But if your core belief is that you and a few other people are very clever, and you know what's best for the population as a whole, but they won't understand this. And in particular, they're going to get really annoyed if you tell them you think they're all stupid. You need distractions while you quietly get on with the business of that bit of government you think is needed. You don't have your debates in public. Mm-hmm. So famously, the Conservative Party never argues in public. Absolute loyalty to the point you stab somebody in the back and they're out. But you don't have your debates in public because you don't want the public knowing what it is you're debating, because you don't have a very high view of them. So you need the dead cats.
Yep.
It's not wanting to govern, but for the bit of governing you're doing, not wanting to tell people what it is you're actually doing because they might not like it.
Well, thinking of that process, because I had a whole book to write about it, so I tried to name and shame the guilty men and women. I tried to create a sort of vertically integrated chain of right-wing culture wars. I say right-wing because the people at the start had to be politically motivated and very rich at the same time. And then you followed a variety of mercenaries, mainly mercenaries, who would help politically motivated and very rich people. So you would have their own world of lobbyists and PRs working at various levels in various ways. You would have what I call the Tufton Street world of think tanks, meaning right-wing, free market, and obscurely funded. Opaquely funded is the word people use, opaquely funded. And all those people's relationships, in turn, with legislators, with MPs and lords, and their relationships with very sympathetic political editors of right-wing newspapers. And by the lights of the Media Reform Coalition, that means, in terms of print copies, I know it's imperfect, but it's the only way really to do it. In terms of print copies, that means somewhere near 90% are right-wing supporting, and there are clearly signs that some of them are reform supporting. So that's how it's done on that side. How is it done at all on the left?
It's not done much on the left. I mean, the key thing about the left is there are hardly any big funders. The big funders only come in when the Labour Party moves to the right. And then you get Lord Sainsbury, giving some money, or whatever, Palantir giving 4 million. But the left doesn't have big funders. That's why it's relied on the trade unions, thousands of people collecting the money. And the more you move towards the left, so in the Greens' current position, the more they're going to rely on their members. And there are very few enlightened, what I call enlightened rich people, a tiny number of patriotic millionaires.
You know about the patriotic millionaires movement, whatever it is.
Yes, but it's a couple of dozen, and they're very nice.
Yes.
But we have many, many hundreds more millionaires than that.
Yes.
So it's an interesting thought experiment over what would the left do if it did have money, but that never occurs. It's never the case. There's also outside money. I mean, the most recent one that was revealed was Viktor Orban funding a number of people in Britain with fellowships of $10,000 a month, that kind of thing. So there is interference in this. And of course, Hungary isn't doing it by itself. It's supported by Russia and Putin.
Yes.
And if you want to get really conspiratorial about it, what keeps Russia going? It's China.
Yes.
And if you do think democracy is a mess where basically multimillionaires and billionaires control the parties and decide what happens, and you want people to believe that a more authoritarian but structured thing, you can delve into this. But there's a whole set of people with money, including foreign governments, but including multimillionaires, who are willing to play with part of their money to enter this game. Your average very rich person, I don't know, one of the bosses of Netflix, would give $50 million to his former university. That's a normal thing a very rich person does. But it only takes a minority of the rich to go, I want something for my money. I want to see politics being disrupted in what they view as a good way. Because the great fear of many people with money, the huge fear, and you talk to them, is why don't the masses realise they're being screwed? And why haven't they come for my cash? That is a abiding fear. If you've got a large amount of money, more than 20 million, you're asking yourself, are they really that stupid that they can't organise themselves to not let me? Once you've got 20 million, it'll grow by itself and get bigger and bigger forever. Your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren need never work, which means other people are going to have to work for them. And your biggest fear is that this won't be realised.
Yeah.
Your family office at some point in future will be dissolved. There'll be a windfall tax on the wealth. We might get a proportional property tax, say 1% on a property worth $1 million, 2% on 2 million, 3% a year on 3 million, 10% a year on 10 million. You'll have to pay £1 million a year council tax with a proportional property tax, which would help improve the housing market and stop people buying houses just to make money, but absolutely ruins your life. So the incentive to get involved in politics, to try to make sure that people don't get together and rearrange things in such a way that they could just get a house with a mortgage again for a decent amount of money that doesn't cripple them. You've got a huge incentive if you're very rich not to have people sort out some of these problems, because it's bad news generally for you It need not be. I promised this last time I mentioned the Nordic countries, but they're interesting because they have big wealth inequalities. But they have a kind of quiet deal with the rich, where the rich in Nordic countries are not touched, but they don't get involved in politics. So there is a kind of middle-of-the-road future for the rich, but you're also allowed to walk across their land, and they have to make sure that the footpaths are nice and safe.
Has anyone done an analysis of groups amongst the rich, not only who they are and what they do and how they feel about the world, but also how much they've got? It seems to me that you can't exert financial influence over people's political behaviours until you've got about 100 million.
100 million for not worrying about it at all. There's been lots and lots of work which is getting better and better at trying to work out how much the rich have and how much is hidden in treasure islands.
Yes.
The best academic on it is Ingrid Robbins in the Netherlands, who's done countless surveys of the very rich and also attitudes of people in the Netherlands to having over a certain amount of money. The last really nice social analysis I saw of who the rich are was published way back in 1968 in a book called The Rich. And it's a lovely book to read. It's a little penguin book, I think. What's hilarious is that the rich never had as less than they had in 68, but we still had a group called The Rich. And it had kind of advice for the rich. It was a book written for the general public, but it said, oh, what are you going to do? And it said, oh, you can go into academia. That's
Yes.
You need a job.
Yes.
And it talks about businessmen with expense accounts being rich.
Yes.
The fact that you could claim your hotel bills. It shows how equal we were back then.
And it does show what spectacular aggregations of money have come out of new forms of business, new kinds of globalism, that sort of prosperity, as it seems, almost bourgeois prosperity of that period is so dwarfed by the aggregations of maybe a smaller group of people, but much more spectacular fun.
Yeah, and the businessman having a nice life with an expense account doesn't really exist nowadays. I mean, you see it. I'm always shocked when I see people in a pub asking for a seat because they're going to claim it back. It just seems disrespectful. But the people who are doing that are no longer having the easy lives of business people in the past. They're worrying about paying their mortgage and so on. The money has really concentrated amongst a small group. If you look at the Sunday Times Rich list, it used to be 1,000 families. At some point, I think they dropped off the bottom 750 families because they weren't doing that well. The top 250 families are still doing very well, but there's growing inequality amongst the rich list, and that's only 1,000 families in the UK.
And the entry point, the threshold for the top 1% is what, 180-something thousand a year income?
Income for the top 1%, but wealth is trickier because you're not really safe until you're within a fraction of the 1%. 10 million doesn't go that far.
No.
It's about 20 when your wealth will carefully stewarded, you can live on, it'll grow slightly by itself. But 100 will grow faster as long as your advisors are sensible. So because the more wealth you have, the faster it'll grow. And because there are much fewer wealth taxes than there used to be and a lot less diligence than there used to be, the people with the most have got more and more and more. And those people who used to be rich are more often struggling. So going back to the private schools, if you go to the elite private schools of Britain now, you'll increasingly find that their pupils are from abroad.
Yes.
It's no longer the families of England.
Yeah, but when we talk about the political rich, you could take such a person as Sir Paul Marshall, who is, I think, in the rich list, defined as having 750 million, something like that, and has shown himself very, very politically engaged, not just for attention and credit. He's not giving away memorial things to universities. He's getting himself involved in media and influence. Who else, what else is like that in this country? You can see what's happening in America, because this current American government is pressuring conglomerate media owners here or there or wherever the sensitivities are to get them to play ball. And so the current issue is all about Paramount and Warner Brothers HBO and what will happen, because CNN is in that package. What will happen to CNN in that package? Is there anything comparable to that here, do you think?
Well, we've still got the Murdochs. I mean, we're waiting for what happens after Rupert.
Yes.
We've become used to Rupert Murdoch. We now don't see it as shocking. It's been so long. That what's particularly interesting, I think, in Britain is how hard the people who are funding these things try to hide. So they're generally not proud of it. You can't easily find the people behind Tufton Street, the person who actually owns number 55 and so on. They really don't want to be known. So it is much more obscure. The people who own the Mayfair office that Nigel Farage used for his quarters, I think it's a private equity company, I've forgotten which, because it's obscure. Peter Kernaghan has done the most investigative journalism work on this and the dark money. But it's very easily forgettable because they're not flamboyant names like Boris Johnson, and they don't want to be remembered or known outside of their own shooting parties, I guess, where they're hopefully, not hopefully, but I assume they want somebody to say you're doing a good job to them. But they really are genuinely pretty quiet about what they're doing. But Reform has had the most funding of any political party since the 2024 election and could get a lot more.
This stonking 14 million from somebody in Thailand.
Yeah. And there's a lot more quiet lobbying. The fact that we don't have a law that stops people from abroad funding our political parties is quite stunning. And that doesn't happen by accident. Again, it's incredibly useful that the revelations about Peter Mandelson have come out, because it's an example of how you can get overseas interests asking for things to be done, and then it's appearing that things are done by somebody possibly who's in the cabinet. That was the impression gained. Now, Peter was caught because of a series of emails, but there'll be many, many people who'll never be caught, who are just quietly courted. You can see it in the donations to members of Parliament. Often it's only a 5,000 or 10,000 donation from a particular person, but he, almost always a he then makes the same to another favoured Labour MP, another one. They're all on the right of the party. So it's not that hard to see it happening. And this is it within our governing Labour Party, where the individual donations to MPs more often now comes from a few people who are rich than from the trade unions of the past. It's enough to stultify our politics, I think.
Now, a lot of a certain kind of right-wing culture war comes from people like David Goodhart, who have said his, not quite mirror image, not at all, but Matthew Goodwin, who've come from, in the case of David Goodhart, the only Etonian Marxist in his road in North London sort of person, and with Matthew Goodwin, who was an academic, who co-wrote a very interesting book back in 2014 that attracted my interest. And I was politically illiterate then, but somehow Revolt on the Right got me interested. And in both their cases, they've utterly changed. And part of the argument is that there's been an enormous growth, not in the super rich that you described, because it's a matter of effectively describing and quantifying, but about a group called the liberal elite or the metropolitan liberal elite. And according to Matthew Goodwin, sometimes that group is as big as 25% of the population, which seems utterly absurd to me. That isn't a proper elite. And in the case of David Goodhart, who is, of course, a much better writer, and it's about people who owe their allegiance to real things, their friends, their families, their local reality. They are somewheres, and people who are anywheres. And the anywheres are the product of excessive education.
Mm-hmm.
In every case, the anywheres don't know that they're born because they've had too much education. Worse still, they are educators, and it's their fault. And meanwhile, these people, the overeducated liberal elite, are very contemptuous of real people in real places, and they say things like Hillary Clinton, deplorables. And that is used very effectively and in a variety of ways, in voting terms and in terms of, it always seems to me, beating self-conscious bourgeois people around the head and making them feel ashamed of themselves.
Yes.
It's like the way in which a whole generation of middle class, and many of them privately educated people, came to favour football over cricket. And things like that. You had to have a football club. Ideally, it would be, if you were living in Hampshire, it would be Manchester United, and so on. And it was fascinating to watch. And people have been beaten around the head with that thing, what's called justifiable grievances. But the relationship between justifiable grievances and the answer you're peddling for that is very, very interesting. Could you explain the social geography of Brexit?
Okay. I published an article in the British Medical Journal within a few days of the vote.
Good place.
Well, a good place because they use statisticians to check your articles before they're allowed to be published. And the key thing about the Brexit vote, well, key to remember that a lot of people didn't vote. And most of the people who didn't vote were poorer, working class than in the north.
Yes.
The majority of the vote for yes was in the south of England, in an area which contained a minority of the electorate. The majority of the Leave vote was social class A and B. This was essentially a middle-class Southern Conservative vote, which is hardly surprising as it was Conservative MPs who'd been pushing for this for years. There were a few places in the north with very high Leave votes, not that many, and certainly not with a large population. But the vote was stigmatised as if it was poor people in the north voting to Leave, whereas the majority of people who Leave were better off older people in the south of England. It was Hampshire. It was almost by accident that we got the story wrong, because the media were expecting to be announcing a narrow Remain win. That's what the polls had been showing all the way up to the results, and the spread betting in particular, where people put their money on betting on the result, was showing Remain would win. I remember Parliament was murdered a few days before the vote, and that meant people just assumed, people are going to vote Remain. And they were so shocked by the 52-48 result as it was coming out that the media, and particularly the BBC, looked for a scapegoat, because Sunderland always reports first. I'll never forget the camera zoomed in to two men without very much hair and a blonde woman in Sunderland, and that became the image. And I wish I had somehow managed to get access to the studio in W1A that night, because what I'd have quietly asked everybody is, where do your parents live and how did they vote? Because I bet you the majority of the parents of the people producing the news programme would have voted Leave and be affluent and lived in places like Hampshire, whereas, of course, the majority of people producing the programme would be your metropolitan elite Remainers. But it's slowly getting out that this was the story, but I don't think that successfully.
I don't think it's... Look, in terms of people who don't spend all day thinking about these things and don't do demographic analyses, I think it is widely believed that it was the red wall left behind, not the decent working class people, but not the very poorest, and certainly not the very most louche ends of the working class. It was nor minorities, that it was Essex plus Sunderland. That is the picture that most people retail now. And you're saying that the reality of the Brexit vote, of that 52%, it was the middle class of Hampshire what won it.
Yeah, I actually published a walking route. You know, we have this kind of the Pennine Way and these other routes. I published the longest possible walking route where you could walk all the way through the south of England to Cornwall and around, and it was hundreds of miles long, and never step in an area that was majority Remain. You know, you have to avoid the middle of London, not all of London, but most of it in the middle. You've got to avoid Oxford, you've got to avoid Bristol, you've got to avoid Brighton. But as long as your walk involves those areas, you could have happily walked for mile after mile in southern England and never step into a majority Remain area. And these are now the southern England counties which are looking as if they're going to go to the far-right party. So we have a polarisation where somewhere like Sussex, Brighton is a fight between Labour and the Greens, but all the rest of the county, which is much, much larger in terms of population, is looking as if it will go to Reform. And that simply reflects the Brexit vote and life in these places for a majority of people. Despite the fact they're social class A and B, despite the fact they're mostly homeowners, they can see that their children are struggling to pay a mortgage or having to rent in their 40s, and they're really worried about their grandchildren. Those worries can be translated into telling them to fear the immigrants coming and so on. But it's a worry about the future and a worry about what's going to happen to this country, I think, in hindsight. And certainly there was racism there, but the majority of this is not racism. We gave people a ridiculous choice. We gave them a choice of nothing's going to change in the most unequal country of Europe, or you can vote for the first time in your life for something utterly different. And it's the first time in their, well, actually in many of the cases it's the second time, because these people who voted leave got to vote to join because they're old enough, so they got to vote in the 70s. But 90% of people live in parliamentary constituencies where their vote doesn't matter. And suddenly you give people a vote that matters and a very simple choice between change nothing or change something big. And in a way, in hindsight, it's like almost endearing that people had enough about them to go, well, if you're going to give me that choice, I'm going to vote to leave then.
Now, you've got a wonderful platform. You've written lots of books. People know who you are. Why haven't you been able to reach out and tell people this extraordinary story? Because it's so contrapuntal in every way, counterintuitive, etc. For I would say, a majority of sentient Brits, it's totally counterintuitive.
It's not hard to argue against my story. So the way you argue against it, you say, well, let's ignore everybody who didn't vote. And if you ignore everybody who didn't vote,
yes,
then you can say, of those people who did vote in these very poor areas like Stoke, a lot of people voted to leave. But the key thing is there aren't that many people in Stoke. It's depopulated for decades and decades. So it doesn't actually matter in a referendum how people in areas of low population vote as much as how they matter in Hampshire, a county of over 1 million people.
Yes, so the former 5 towns are shrinking.
Yeah.
And the Sussex-Hampshire border is growing.
Yeah. Of course, there'll be an inability on my behalf, but you tend not to get that many single individuals on the left dominating views. One reason why the people you mentioned may have gone towards more right-wing politics is it's much easier to get a hearing. First of all, there are fewer of you. There are hundreds of people like me. Increasingly, they're young and female. They very carefully write a book, unlike me, I write too many. They write their one careful book. They're ever so polite because they don't want to upset anybody. It's a stereotype, so that there aren't that many big headlines. Whereas there are fewer voices on the other side, much better at grabbing attention, and a very pliant media, very willing to tell the story over and over and over again in the Daily Mail and the Sun and the Times and the Telegraph. And the BBC are scared of appearing to be biased. So they won't tell this particular story. They won't necessarily believe it. Their measure of kind of bias is what is the median in the newsprint? What is the average in the newsprint?
But we've got, as we know, a fantastically biased newsprint universe.
But the BBC are very sensitive of being seen as left-wing. They're not sensitive at all of being seen as being right-wing, because their strongest critics come from the right. During the Brexit debate before the vote, they endlessly put up the same economics professor for leave because they couldn't find another one. But they put him up repeatedly. I think I've forgotten his name. It could be Patrick Minford. I don't know. It's
Patrick Minford. Sorry, Patrick Minford.
But
you're absolutely right. It is Patrick Minford.
Yeah.
But are you saying that if you got together with a very, very good indie production company who had an in and credibility with the BBC, let us say the BBC, you got in there with a very attractive and amusing film in which you traipsed around in the Sussex-Hampshire borders.
No, I did this. I got 5 minutes on Newsnight where we spent the whole day filming in Tewkesbury, a different area. Tewkesbury, it's voted leave, that picture postcard town.
Yeah.
They did a lovely job of producing it brilliantly. 5 minutes about who it is who left. But that's a Newsnight, late at night once. Yeah. I did try. I haven't been entirely... I wrote a book called Rule Britannia on this with my friend Sally Tomlinson, and I gave something like 200 public talks afterwards, all in the south of England, in the 5 years after, all in the south of England, all in areas that majority voted leave. Partly I wanted to understand it, so I wanted to know what people would tell me, which is why I got back from my audiences. Very often they're worried about their grandchildren. But I did learn another thing. I learned that all the leave areas in the south are really difficult to get to by train. It was quite hard. If you do a talk and you're finishing at 8 o'clock at night or 8:30 in some church hall, one of the distinctive things about leave areas is you could maybe just catch the last train and get back to Oxford, whereas the remain areas of the south are all highly connected, full of youngsters, very near train stations.
Yes, I can see that. I used to think about this concern a lot because I'm by background a market researcher. So I'm the veteran of 2 billion group discussions with all sorts of people in all sorts of places, pretty much across the world. Of course, I would be directing things from behind a two-way mirror, not in, let's say, Tokyo or whatever. But when you were doing it in this country, you had to think, how can I get back home? Or do I have to stay in a hotel or what? It's a very, very real consideration. But how is it that in this country allegedly run by the metropolitan liberal elite, that somebody like you, who is explaining something people would want explained, and with a pretty astonishing, as I say, counterintuitive thing, haven't been given anywhere a big opportunity to talk to ordinary folk?
You don't get it. Take another example, the 2-child limit. Right, the 2-child limit on benefit, which you had from 2016 till a few days ago, 10 years of this thing, brought in by George Osborne because he thought it would stop people having babies. He literally said the feckless caused a huge increase in poverty. Within a few years, we had research showing no reduction in people having births at all. Nobody at the point of coitus goes, oh, hold on a second, this is child number 3. We're not going to get the benefit for them, right? It didn't stop people having children. And the irony of all this was, the people who pushed for it actually wanted more children born in Britain anyway, but caused immense misery. There was a lot of lobbying by dozens of charities campaigning against child poverty, Save the Children. This is children. Right? It should be easy. Enormous number of charities lobbied against the 2-child limit, but still we had a majority population in Britain who thought that this was a good thing, that we weren't going to give £20 a week to somebody with a third child. And Labour had to be absolutely hounded by their backbench MPs to finally reverse it. And it's such an easy story. We had the biggest increase of any rich country in the world in child poverty as a result by United Nations figures. Absolutely shameful. A really easy story. Nobody was allowed to tell that story. No, you won't see a single media story saying, here's the latest United Nations League table of child poverty. The UK had the biggest rise and also had one of the highest rates amongst rich countries to begin with, and the biggest rise. Absolutely devastating story. And about children, which is always the easiest thing to talk about with poverty. In the past, nobody would blame a child for being born into a particular family. But in American politics, I now see that being said over children being deported. Almost they should have chosen better parents. I worry that I'm trying to make myself feel better about having written lots of books and lots of articles and not punch an opinion that much. The effects of all the work that people like me do is much less than the effects of who controls the trolls on social media. If you remember Twitter from before it was X, it was actually slightly interesting. And you know,
Yes.
I went from, I don't know, 20,000 or more people following me, just absolutely disappeared. My tweets, which were seen before Elon took, so there are these things going on as well.
So basically, the Elon regime scrubbed you out.
Scrubbed me out of that social media, doing a party called Political for Broadcast for Labour, one of our main two parties, being interviewed on that was enough for me to seem, I think, as too partisan for the BBC. They had me on again recently on Today programme, but I'm kind of, grudgingly, we're not quite sure about him. You never know what he might say.
Yes.
Even newspapers like The Guardian. But people like me or Owen Jones and so on, we're much less in the pages of The Guardian now.
I've noticed that. What do you put that down to?
Well, one problem is that most of these papers are read online, and so they can see how many people are reading an article. And a worthy article about the 2-child limit is not going to get many clicks.
Yeah.
And to get clicks, I could go down the line, and you just see me being careful. Folk on the left tend to be careful, tend to be gentle. I could go down the line of saying, let's talk about George Osborne. Let's talk about the fact he had 2 children at a point. Let's talk about the fact that when he was sacked, he went to Vietnam and fired off a machine gun at $1 a bullet, and what kind of person is George? And could make it about him, quite personal, and could get 10 times or 20 times as many clicks for a story if Oxford University professor says nasty things about former Chancellor. Right? But we folk on the left, we just don't do that.
But it's such fascinating stuff. And I say this in a very caring way. George Osborne is a very fascinating person.
He's a fascinating person, and you could go in, and if somebody did this and went into great detail about him, his own psychology himself, and why was he the Chancellor who presided over the biggest increase in child poverty in the rich world, it'd be a fascinating story. But we play the ball. We don't attack people. But the other way around, of course, you are attacked. It's just you're describing about being part of this, like me being a cosmopolitan, place-free intellectual who's overeducated. It's done back to us, although you get used to it.
Yeah. Do you get trolled a lot?
It's stopped remarkably since Trump. Tufton Street have stopped writing articles about me. They wrote at least a dozen about Danny Dorling's Wrong Again. They wrote 3 articles on Worst Book Ever about 3 of my books, which I thought was a highly recommended. Each one was worse than the one before.
Yes. Had I known, gosh.
Trump in some ways has helped a lot because suddenly this politics is associated with Donald. And you watch Donald speaking or look at his tweets and it doesn't look good. And I think it's really damaged Tufton Street. They have a lot of very much younger folk now. They have people in their early 20s now being chief advisor on tax reduction or something. It's not the same set of people anymore. They also remember when Liz Truss became Prime Minister, she brought in the people from Tufton Street and gave them jobs.
Yes. And they said how wonderful she was, just like the Mail. This is the wonderfulest budget that ever was.
Yeah, so they had their fingers burnt over that. And I suspect there's a calculation at the moment going on. You've got to be very careful of pushing things on the far right, because if it becomes associated with Trump, it'll be associated with being stupid.
Yeah.
And so I get less trolling. I get much more sympathetic audiences at public events. I don't do as many talks. The shocking thing in recent years has been no longer getting the nasty question. You're always ready. My favourite one was at the LSE once. I was doing a public talk and somebody asked me, why am I lying? And the reason he asked me why I was lying was he thought I was clever, but thought I couldn't possibly believe what I was saying. So I must be lying for some reason. And it took 5 minutes, this interchange, and I got the audience to vote over whether they thought I was lying, or whether I really believed what I was saying.
Brilliant.
But this kind of thing, you get used to it, you get better, although it puts a lot of people off. getting involved. It puts, I'm an old, fat, big, white, upper middle class man. It puts people who are not white off to a large extent. Academics who are not white, very little in the media, deliberately. It really puts women off. So, as I was saying earlier, to stereotype, there's a book out today about private equity by Hetty O'Brien. Research done over years, 10 years, brilliant book. It's actually #1 bestseller on international finance. But folk like Hetty O'Brien, she may not, apart from Asaka, there's hardly, women are really put off from putting their head up and presenting things because of the way our media works. But it has gone quieter since Trump.
Well, obviously, and I was looking recently, British people don't like him, period. There's a slight change somewhat of a change across the Ramon intenders, but nonetheless, British people as a whole don't like him one bit and have liked him even less since what's been happening in the Middle East. And I think that is obviously a weakness for Farage, who can't get away from the fact that they are great mates and he used to be the opening act on Trump's old musical tours. And I think that has changed things. Yeah. But nonetheless, coming from where I was originally coming from, in other words, the understanding and persuasion business, but the business, why it is that the left is, item one, there isn't the great millionaire at the end of the chain. That I completely understand, and it costs money to rent loudspeakers. But there's also another thing, is that the left seems unable to agree on messaging, clarity of messaging, and certainly is very, very sensitive about all sorts of things that the right would use in a completely shameless way. There's a whole area of subject matter which you would think with professional persuaders would be obvious things to use and are never used by the left. Why is that?
I think it just goes back to, or it may be my naive political bias. People on the left tend to be more pro-social, tend to be nicer, tend not to like bullying, tend not to respect it, and worry. If we were to have a talk about trans, which I would be happy to do, but I would worry greatly that it would be the 2 minutes clipped out of what I would say on this.
Yes.
So it's that. And if you look at the history of the left, the prime ministers who presided over falls and inequality for Labour were Attlee and Wilson. And they weren't really megalomaniacs. They had whole cabinets behind them and general agreement. It wasn't, you weren't voting Labour to get Attlee as Prime Minister. You were voting for something else. The left is sceptical of charismatic, media-savvy people. Tony Blair is its best ever media-savvy politician.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, by far. But of course, people would now argue inequality didn't fall one jot under him. We went on an unnecessary war.
Yeah.
He squandered, many, many years in power. The left is much more female than the right. The rise of the left is much larger amongst young women, although it's still more young men are left-wing than right-wing. And it doesn't play it this way. But you could also argue that if we were any good at this, we would be absolutely dominant. It's not. Because the arguments are relatively simple. 95% of you will be better off in a better organised society. You could have trains that run on time. You could have water to drink, which doesn't have a danger of having sewage in it. You don't have to be giving all your money to a tiny number of people. The arguments are so simple. We don't have to have the most expensive housing in Europe at the lowest quality. We don't have to have people homeless on the streets. They don't in some European countries. The arguments are so simple as compared to the arguments on the right, which allow a small number of people to get very rich and it'll do you some good somehow. If the left were good at this, the whole thing would have shifted over years ago.
Well, as you say, the great communicators were Tony Blair, ably assisted, of course, by Alistair and Peter, but it didn't quite come out right, did it? Who would you like to be running the Labour Party now? Or maybe you're going to say the incumbent.
You never know what the incumbent could do. And this is the charitable side of the left in me, because he is the most unpopular leader ever, Prime Minister ever, but every single last one has been the most unpopular ever since before Blair. Brown managed to be less popular than Blair, so they've all done badly. Somebody like Burnham, with his ability just to talk normally and a bit animated, and some experience outside of London now for some time about life in the majority of the country. But I'm optimistic. There are, over 300 MPs. Amongst those number, there must be some salt-of-the-earth people who would be good, or even somebody very boring. So the reason I supported Corbyn is that I wanted German conservative policies. So I like Merkel. And Corbyn's manifesto was to almost make us like Germany in 5 years, which would have been very hard to do. But it was a conservative German political programme. Now, you'd never say when Merkel was young, oh, she's the person who's going to become Chancellor for that long. So you can't necessarily predict who might be seen as popular. But we've got local elections coming up. The polls are truly awful. We haven't had the far right be this high in the country since the 1930s. We are in a serious situation. And we're also probably the main target of the billionaires in the USA, whose second home is a very nice apartment in a skyscraper in London. They would love a reform government.
Could you marshal the evidence behind that? Because it's extraordinary. And you're saying they're making more effort here than in other European countries.
Certainly than in other European countries. So after Tufton Street and after London, London is the biggest centre of right-wing think tanks in Europe, by far. The second biggest home is Warsaw. And again, that's American influence. I think they've got their own offspring of the Adam Smith Institute, but it might only employ 2 or 3 people. And again, it's American influence and funding. It isn't that the polls themselves came up with, let's have a whole set of pro-neoliberal far-right things. And it's tiny. And it matters because one effect of Brexit was that suddenly the EU no longer had to deal with a whole set of far-right think tanks because they weren't in the EU anymore. It's just it's constant interest. It's a special relationship. It's the relationship between our banks and our finance, between New York and London. It's the ease of language. This is still a relatively rich country worth fighting over. There are occasional interests in Mexico, obvious ones in Venezuela, but the serious one is the UK. And we are the country that allowed the bombers to fly from us. Other European countries don't, as far as I know. But also the vision, I think, that the billionaires or the people who advise the billionaires have of a world that's more in their image. The USA isn't big enough. They need other places. We are on the target list of obvious places where, as far as they see it, a better politics would be better, people believing in the great replacement theory.
Yes.
It's the softest touch.
You've done and talked about and written about completely wonderful things that I found astonishing and inspirational, and immediately thought, why doesn't everybody else know this? That's really the question I'd like to leave you with. How do you get this out to a much wider audience? It's becoming an increasingly urgent question, isn't it?
It's urgent, but you get it out slowly and relentlessly. Because the Dead Cat Brigade, one of their weaknesses is because they're bunging another dead cat and something new on the table all the time.
Yeah.
Talking about an old debate again and saying, by the way, the Brexit vote isn't as they said. They're no longer talking about it. They're moving on to the next thing.
Yes.
So it's this old and relentless way of doing it. One way in which we try to deal with racism over years. How do you deal with people coming up with racist arguments? You relentlessly say that these things are wrong. And in many ways, people who've done this have won more often than they've lost. But it's not sudden. It's a slog. It's a really long slog of endlessly saying, no, some groups are not more stupid than others. No, don't. And again and again and again. And I'm afraid that is generally the way in which the left has worked. So you could say that over time, as you look at our societies, they have become more left-wing in many ways in which we behave, even when we got more unequal. We don't let children starve. We don't tolerate a whole number of things. We won't worry about gender pay gaps and so on. Things that would have seemed incredible 20 or 30 years ago. But it's very unrewarding and hard work compared to the banging something on the table. And it'd be lovely if it was possible to bang something on the table and do it. But it would have been done if it was that easy, I think.
Huge thanks to Professor Danny Dorling and his eye-opening revelations. Next time, I'll be talking to David Aronovich, former Times columnist and presenter of BBC Radio 4's The Briefing Room, a man who's been through a fair few culture wars himself and knows how these arguments get made, twisted, and sold. This podcast is presented by me, Peter York, and it's produced by Kate Dixon at Good Egg Productions. Do listen in again. Goodbye.